The mountain wind howled through the pines as Sandra Martinez pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eye, and her torn dress clung to her trembling frame. Behind her, the sound of heavy boots crushing through the underbrush grew closer, accompanied by harsh voices that made her stomach clench with terror. "I'm too ugly for any man, sir," she had whispered to the stranger just hours ago, those words now echoing in her mind like a cruel prophecy. The memory of his response, the way his calloused hands had cupped her face with unexpected gentleness, seemed like a dream from another lifetime. Stephen Edwards had looked at her with those piercing blue eyes and said something that had shattered every belief she held about herself. "Look at me. You're not." But now, as the men who had been hunting her drew nearer, Sandra wondered if she would live long enough to understand what those words truly meant. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her heart pound harder against her ribs. "We know you're out there, girl. Might as well come out peaceful like. We ain't gonna hurt you none if you cooperate." The lies rolled off their tongues as easily as water flowed downhill. Sandra had seen what these men were capable of, had witnessed their cruelty firsthand. Her fingers tightened around the small knife Stephen had given her, its weight both comforting and terrifying in her palm. The story had begun 3 days earlier when Sandra first arrived in the remote mountain town of Cedar Falls, her few possessions tied in a bundle and her hope hanging by the thinnest of threads. She had traveled for weeks, following rumors of work and a chance to start fresh, leaving behind a life that had been nothing but disappointment and heartache. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where strangers were viewed with suspicion and women traveling alone were seen as either desperate or dangerous. Sandra fell into the first category, though she suspected most of the townspeople would have preferred the latter. The boarding house where she hoped to find lodging was run by a stern woman named Mrs. Hartwell, whose gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. She looked Sandra up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at market. "You got money for a room?" the older woman asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Sandra reached into her worn purse and counted out the few coins she had left. It was barely enough for 2 nights, maybe 3 if she didn't eat. "Some," she replied, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. Mrs. Hartwell's expression softened slightly. "Room's $2 a night, meals extra. You can work in the kitchen to help cover costs if you're willing." The arrangement was far from ideal, but Sandra had learned long ago that beggars couldn't afford to be choosers. She spent her first day scrubbing pipes and serving meals to the handful of other boarders, most of whom barely acknowledged her existence. It was on her second evening in Cedar Falls that she first encountered Stephen Edwards. He came into the boarding house dining room like a force of nature, his presence filling the space in a way that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. He was tall, probably 6 feet and 2 inches, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and hands that looked like they had been shaped by years of hard work. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in town, and his beard was neatly trimmed but substantial. Most striking of all were his eyes, a blue so deep they reminded Sandra of mountain lakes she had seen in picture books as a child. The other diners fell silent when he entered, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched him scan the room. Sandra, who had been refilling water glasses, found herself frozen in place, the pitcher trembling slightly in her hands. He chose a table in the corner, away from the other patrons, and Sandra realized with a mixture of dread and anticipation that she would be the one serving him. She approached slowly, keeping her eyes downcast as she had learned to do around men who might mistake confidence for invitation. "What can I get you, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When he didn't answer immediately, she risked a glance upward and found him studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks burn. She instinctively raised her hand to cover the scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, a souvenir from her previous life that she tried her best to hide. "Just some stew and bread," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest. "And coffee, if you've got it hot." Sandra nodded quickly and hurried away, grateful for the excuse to escape his penetrating gaze. In the kitchen, she tried to steady her breathing while Mrs. Hartwell ladled stew into a bowl. The older woman noticed her flustered state and shook her head knowingly. "That's Stephen Edwards," she said without being asked. "Lives up in the mountains. Comes to town maybe once a month for supplies. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's good people. Lost his wife and little girl in a fever outbreak about 5 years back." The information hit Sandra like a physical blow. She understood loss, understood the way grief could hollow out a person until they were nothing but a shell going through the motions of living. When she returned to his table with the food, she found herself looking at him differently, seeing past the intimidating exterior to the pain that lurked beneath. He ate in silence, methodically working through the stew while Sandra went about her duties. She was careful not to stare, but she found her gaze drawn to him repeatedly throughout the evening. It wasn't until she was clearing his empty dishes that he spoke to her again. "You're new in town," he observed, and it wasn't really a question. "Yes, sir, just arrived yesterday, running from something or running to something." The directness of the question caught her off guard. Sandra found herself answering honestly before she could think better of it. "Both, I suppose." He nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. Sometimes that's the only way to move forward. Sandra wanted to ask him what he was running from, but she didn't dare. Instead, she finished clearing his table and watched as he left money for his meal, plus a generous tip. He stood to leave, and for a moment their eyes met across the small distance between them. In that brief connection, Sandra felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of shared pain that was both comforting and terrifying. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Sandra was in the kitchen, helping prepare breakfast, when Mrs. Hartwell burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and worry. "There's been trouble up at the Brennan place," she announced. "Someone broke in during the night, took what little money they had, and roughed up old Mr. Brennan something fierce. Sheriff thinks it might be those drifters that came through last week." Sandra's blood ran cold. She remembered the drifters, three rough-looking men who had spent an evening in the boarding house dining room, drinking too much and speaking too loudly about easy money and stupid mountain folk. As if summoned by the conversation, Stephen Edwards appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. Sandra's heart skipped a beat at the sight of him, tall and imposing in his worn leather coat and sturdy boots. "Heard about the Brennans," he said simply. "I'll be joining the search." Stephen's gaze found Sandra across the kitchen, and she felt that same electric connection from the night before. What she saw in his eyes this time was different, though, a kind of protective intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You be careful, girl," he said, and though he was addressing her directly, his words carried to everyone in the room. Men like that, they don't just take money and move on. The warning sent a chill down Sandra's spine, but it also awakened something else, a warmth that spread through her chest at the realization that this man, this stranger, was concerned for her safety. The search party left town within the hour, a grim-faced group of men armed with rifles and determination. Sandra watched them go from the boarding house porch, her eyes following Stephen's broad-shouldered figure until he disappeared into the tree line. It was late afternoon when the first shots rang out, echoing across the valley like thunder. Sandra was hanging laundry behind the boarding house when the sound reached her, causing her to drop the wet sheet she had been pinning to the line. It was well past dark when the search party finally returned, their faces grim and their clothes dirty from a hard day in the wilderness. Sandra was in the dining room pretending to work while actually watching the street through the window when she saw them riding back into town. Her heart leaped when she spotted Stephen among them, apparently unharmed, but her relief was short-lived when she saw the body draped over one of the horses. The next morning brought the full story. The search party had tracked the drifters to an abandoned cabin in the high country, where they had apparently been planning to wait out the initial search before moving on. A gunfight had ensued, resulting in the death of one drifter and the wounding of another. The third man, the leader of the group, had escaped into the deep wilderness. Sheriff Morrison gathered the townspeople in the church that evening to discuss the situation, his weathered face serious as he addressed the crowd. "We got two of them," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small building. "But the one that got away, he's the dangerous one, goes by the name of Ralph Ross, and he's got a reputation for violence that stretches from here to California." A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled crowd. Sandra, sitting in the back pew, felt her hands begin to tremble. She had noticed Ralph Ross particularly during the drifters' stay at the boarding house. had seen the way his cold gray eyes lingered on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. As the meeting broke up, Sandra found herself walking slowly back to the boarding house, her mind racing with worry. The streets seemed darker than usual, every shadow potentially hiding danger. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the figure following her until a hand fell on her shoulder. She spun around with a cap on, her heart hammering against her ribs, only to find Stephen Edwards standing behind her in the dim light from the street lamps. His face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, but his eyes held their familiar warmth. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice gentle. "Just wanted to make sure you got back safe." Sandra felt her breathing begin to return to normal, though her pulse was still racing for entirely different reasons now. "Thank you," she managed. "That's very kind of you." They walked the rest of the way to the boarding house in comfortable silence, Sandra acutely aware of his presence beside her. When they reached the front steps, he paused, seeming to wrestle with something he wanted to say. "Miss Martinez," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "Sandra, if I may, I want you to know that if you ever need anything, my cabin is about 5 miles north of town, up the old logging road." The offer was unexpected and deeply touching. Sandra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't have said exactly why. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. That means more to me than you know." "Stephen," he corrected, "and I have a feeling you understand more than most people what it means to need help and not know where to find it." The observation was so accurate it took Sandra's breath away. She stared up at him, this man who seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed defenses to the frightened, lonely woman beneath. That night, Sandra lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howling around the building and thinking about Stephen Edwards. There was something about him that called to her, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced since she was a child. She had learned long ago that men like Stephen, strong and capable and devastatingly handsome, didn't waste their time on women like her. The scar on her face was just the most visible of her flaws, the one that made people look away in discomfort or pity. The thought brought back memories of her last relationship. Thomas had been a clerk in the town where she had lived before coming to Cedar Falls, a mild-mannered man who had seemed genuinely interested in her despite her appearance. For a few precious weeks, Sandra had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone could see past her flaws. The illusion had been shattered one evening when she overheard Thomas talking to his friends outside the general store. "I feel sorry for her more than anything," he had said, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "A woman with a face like that, she doesn't have many options." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound Sandra had ever received. She had left town the next morning without saying goodbye, carrying the shame and humiliation with her like a stone in her chest. But Stephen Edwards seemed different somehow. When he looked at her, she didn't see pity or charity in his eyes. She saw something else, something that made her wonder if maybe she had been wrong about herself all along. The next few days passed quietly, with no sign of Ralph Ross or any other trouble. Sandra fell into a routine of work and rest that was almost peaceful, if she didn't count the constant awareness of danger lurking somewhere in the mountains. Stephen came to town twice during that period, both times stopping at the boarding house for a meal and a brief conversation with Sandra that left her feeling warm and confused in equal measure. It was on the fourth day after the search party's return that everything went wrong. Sandra was walking back from the general store where she had been sent to buy supplies for the kitchen, her arms full of packages and her mind on the letter she had received that morning from her sister back east. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the man watching her from the alley between the bank and the barber shop. It wasn't until she heard the soft footsteps behind her that she realized she was being followed. Sandra quickened her pace, her heart beginning to race as the footsteps matched her speed. When she risked a glance over her shoulder, her blood turned to ice. Ralph Ross was about 20 feet behind her, his face twisted into a cruel smile that made her stomach lurch with terror. Sandra broke into a run, her packages scattering across the dusty street as she fled toward the boarding house. Behind her, she could hear Ralph's laughter, a sound like broken glass that made her skin crawl. She reached the front steps of the boarding house and pounded on the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mrs. Hartwell," she called out, her voice high with panic. "Please, let me in." There was no answer from inside, and Sandra remembered with growing horror that the older woman had mentioned going to visit her sister that afternoon. The boarding house was empty, and she was alone with a dangerous man bearing down on her. Ralph reached the bottom of the steps just as Sandra realized her mistake. His gray eyes glittered with malicious amusement as he looked up at her, like a cat that had cornered a particularly interesting mouse. Well, well, he said, his voice a rough whisper that made her skin crawl. If it isn't the pretty little serving girl. Been looking forward to having a conversation with you. Sandra pressed herself against the locked door, her mind racing through possible escape routes. The street was empty, most of the townspeople having retreated indoors for their afternoon rest. What do you want? She managed to ask, though she was terrified of the answer. Ralph's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from tobacco and neglect. Oh, I think you know what I want, sweetheart. See? Your boyfriend and his friends cost me 2 good partners. I figure you owe me some compensation. He's not my boyfriend, Sandra said quickly, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized they might have signed her death warrant. Even better, Ralph replied, taking a step up toward her. Means nobody's going to come looking when you disappear. Sandra's hand closed around the small knife she kept in her pocket, the one Stephen had given her just the day before. She had never used a weapon against another person, but desperation was a powerful teacher. Ralph took another step up, and Sandra could smell the stench of unwashed clothes and stale whiskey that clung to him like a cloud. His good hand reached out toward her face, and she reacted without thinking, pulling the knife from her pocket and slashing wildly at his outstretched arm. The blade caught him across the knuckles, opening a thin line that immediately began to bleed. Ralph jerked his hand back with a curse, his expression shifting from predatory amusement to genuine anger. You little wildcat, he snarled, cradling his wounded hand against his chest. You're going to pay for that. Sandra didn't wait to see what form his revenge would take. She leaped off the side of the porch, landing hard in the flower bed that Mrs. Hartwell maintained beside the building. Pain shot up her ankle as she hit the ground wrong, but adrenaline carried her forward as she limped toward the tree line behind the boarding house. Ralph's roar of fury followed her as she disappeared into the forest, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. She could hear him behind her, his pursuit hampered by his injured arm, but driven by rage and the promise of violence. The forest was a maze of fallen logs and thick undergrowth, made even more treacherous by the fading afternoon light. Sandra's ankle throbbed with every step, but she forced herself to keep moving, following what looked like an old deer trail that wound its way up the mountainside. As darkness began to fall, Sandra realized she was hopelessly lost. The trail had petered out miles back, leaving her to navigate by instinct through terrain that grew more rugged with every step. Her ankle was swollen and painful, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll on her remaining strength. Sandra found a large boulder to rest against and tried to think through her options. She could try to make her way back toward town, but in the darkness, she was just as likely to walk in circles. She could stay where she was and wait for dawn, but that would give Ralph all night to find her trail. The decision was made for her when she heard the soft snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness below her position. Ralph was still out there, still hunting her with the patience of a man who had nothing to lose. Sandra forced herself back to her feet and continued climbing. It was sometime after midnight when she saw the faint glow of firelight through the trees ahead. Sandra's heart leaped with hope, though she forced herself to approach carefully. It could be Stephen's cabin, but it could just as easily be Ralph's campfire. She crept forward through the underbrush until she could see the source of the light more clearly. It was indeed a cabin, larger and more substantial than she had expected, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and warm yellow light spilling from the windows. As she watched, a familiar figure moved past one of the windows, and Sandra nearly sobbed with relief. Stephen Edwards was home. Sandra stumbled out of the tree line and across the small clearing that surrounded the cabin, her remaining strength finally giving out just as she reached the front porch. She collapsed against the heavy wooden door, her fist barely making a sound as she tried to knock. "Stephen," she called out, her voice little more than a whisper. "Please, I need help." The door opened so quickly that Sandra nearly fell forward into the cabin. Strong hands caught her before she could hit the ground, and she found herself looking up into Stephen's concerned face. "Sandra, what happened?" he asked, his voice tight with worry as he helped her inside. "You're hurt." The warmth of the cabin enveloped her like an embrace, and Sandra felt some of the tension leave her body for the first time in hours. Stephen guided her to a chair near the fireplace and knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "Ralph Ross," she managed to say, the name coming out like a curse. "He found me in town. I ran, but he followed me into the forest. I think he's still out there somewhere." Stephen's expression darkened, and Sandra saw something dangerous flicker in his blue eyes. He stood and moved to a gun rack mounted on the wall, selecting a rifle that looked well-maintained and deadly. "You'll be safe here," he said, checking the weapon with practiced efficiency. "This cabin's built like a fortress, and I know these mountains better than any man alive." Sandra watched him prepare for what might come, noting the way he moved with quiet confidence and deadly purpose. This was a different side of Stephen Edwards, the part of him that had survived alone in the wilderness for 5 years and earned the respect of every man in Cedar Falls. Stephen returned to her side and knelt again, this time with a basin of warm water and some clean cloth. "Let me take a look at that ankle," he said, his voice gentle again. "And those cuts on your face need tending too." Sandra submitted to his ministrations, trying not to think about how good it felt to have someone care for her injuries with such tenderness. Stephen's hands were large and calloused from years of hard work, but they moved with surprising delicacy as he cleaned the scratches on her cheek and examined her swollen ankle. "It's not broken," he said finally, wrapping the ankle with practiced skill, "but you'll need to stay off it for a few days. You can have my bed, and I'll take the floor by the fire." "I can't take your bed," Sandra protested, though the thought of lying down somewhere safe and warm was almost overwhelming. "You haven't caused me any trouble," he said quietly. "If anything, you've reminded me that there are still things in this world worth protecting." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Sandra didn't dare interpret too closely. She found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the way the shadows played across his strong jaw. "Stephen," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that were burning in her mind. "Why are you helping me? I'm nobody special, just a woman with nowhere else to go." Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire as if he could find answers in the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. "5 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me," he said. "My wife, my daughter, my reason for getting up in the morning. I thought I was done with caring about anything or anyone. Then you walked into that dining room, and something inside me woke up for the first time since the fever took them." Sandra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had spent so many years believing that she was unworthy of love or even basic kindness that Stephen's words seemed impossible to accept. "But I'm not beautiful," she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to cover the scar on her face. "I'm damaged and plain, and nothing special at all." Stephen reached out and gently took her hand, pulling it away from her face. His touch sent electricity shooting up her arm, and Sandra found herself unable to look away from his intense blue gaze. "Beauty isn't just about what shows on the surface," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's about strength and courage, and the way someone makes you feel when they're near. You have all of that and more, Sandra." The words were like a balm to wounds Sandra had carried for years. She felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of self-doubt that had been her constant companion for so long. Before she could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was the soft whinny of a horse, followed by the creak of leather and the muffled thud of boots hitting the ground. Stephen was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, his body tense and ready for violence. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the window. "Keep low and don't make a sound." Sandra's heart hammered against her ribs as Stephen peered carefully through a gap in the curtains. Outside, she could hear the soft sounds of someone moving around the cabin, testing windows and looking for weaknesses. Ralph Ross's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "I know you're in there, Edwards. Got something that belongs to me, and I aim to take it back." Stephen's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried easily through the heavy log walls. "The only thing out here that belongs to you is a bullet with your name on it, Ross. Best thing you can do is mount up and ride out while you still can." Ralph's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Oh, I don't think so, Mountain Man. See, that little wildcat in there cost me some blood, and I always collect on debts." Sandra felt ice form in the pit of her stomach, The thought of Ralph getting his hands on her was terrifying enough, but the idea that Stephen might be hurt trying to protect her was even worse. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the window. And neither is he. The attack came without warning. One moment the cabin was filled with tense silence, and the next the front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splinters. Ralph Ross came through the opening like a demon from hell, his face twisted with rage and his good hand clutching a wicked-looking knife. Stephen's rifle boomed in the confined space, the muzzle flash lighting up the cabin like lightning. Ralph stumbled but didn't go down, the bullet catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around. He recovered quickly, lunging towards Sandra with the knife raised above his head. Sandra rolled sideways out of the chair, her injured ankle screaming in protest as she hit the floor. Ralph's knife buried itself in the wooden back of the chair where she had been sitting just seconds before. Stephen was already moving, dropping the empty rifle and drawing a pistol from his belt in one smooth motion. Ralph jerked the knife free and turned towards Sandra again, his eyes wild with pain and fury. Blood streamed down his arm from the rifle wound, but he seemed oblivious to everything except his desire for revenge. The shot was deafeningly loud in the small cabin. Sandra's eyes snapped open to see Ralph Ross standing frozen, his knife still raised, but his face wearing an expression of surprise. A red stain was spreading across his shirt front, and as Sandra watched, he looked down at the wound with something like confusion. He took one stumbling step toward her, then another before his legs gave out and he crashed to the floor. Stephen was beside Sandra in an instant, his strong arms lifting her from the floor and carrying her away from Ralph's still form. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of pine and leather that had become so familiar and comforting. "It's over," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Sandra clung to him, letting the reality of her survival wash over her in waves. She was alive, she was safe, and she was in the arms of a man who had risked everything to protect her. Stephen carried her to his bedroom, a small space dominated by a large bed covered with handmade quilts. He set her down gently on the edge of the mattress and knelt before her, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his blue eyes searching her face for signs of injury. Sandra shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Stephen's thumbs brushed away her tears, and she leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "Stephen," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "I thought I was going to die. I thought I'd never see you again." His expression grew fierce, and Sandra saw something primal flicker in his eyes. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," he said, his voice low and intense. "I've spent 5 years thinking I was dead inside, but you brought me back to life." The words were like a key turning in a lock, opening doors in Sandra's heart that she had thought were sealed forever. She reached up and touched his face, marveling at the roughness of his beard beneath her fingertips. "I never thought anyone could want me," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm too damaged, too scarred for someone like you." Stephen's hands tightened on her face, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that took her breath away. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Really look at me." Sandra met his gaze, seeing herself reflected in the blue depths of his eyes. What she saw there wasn't the broken, ugly woman she had always believed herself to be, but someone worthy of love and protection. "You're beautiful," Stephen said, his voice soft but absolutely certain. "Not despite your scars, but because of everything you've survived to get them. You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known." Sandra felt something break open inside her chest, a dam of self-doubt and fear that had been holding back years of suppressed emotions. She leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all of her gratitude and growing love into the contact. Stephen responded immediately, his arms coming around her and pulling her close. The kiss was everything Sandra had dreamed of, and nothing she had dared hope for. It was gentle and fierce at the same time, full of promise and passion and the kind of connection she had thought existed only in stories. "I love you," she whispered, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I know it's too soon and I know I have nothing to offer you, but I can't help it." Stephen's smile was like the sun coming up after the longest night of winter. "You have everything to offer," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your courage, your kindness, your beautiful heart. And I love you too. more than I ever thought possible. They spent the rest of the night talking, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their futures. Sandra learned about Stephen's wife and daughter, how their deaths had nearly destroyed him and how her presence had slowly brought him back to the world of the living. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sandra felt like she was seeing the world clearly for the first time in her life. She was still the same woman who had arrived in Cedar Falls just days before, but everything else had changed. Stephen made breakfast while Sandra rested her injured ankle, and they ate together in comfortable silence, both still processing the events of the previous night. Ralph Ross's body had been wrapped and moved outside, where it would wait for the sheriff's arrival. After breakfast, Stephen helped Sandra outside to sit on the porch, where she could enjoy the mountain air and the spectacular view of the valley below. The cabin was situated on a high ridge, with miles of wilderness stretching out in every direction. "What happens now?" Sandra asked, her hand finding Stephen's where it rested on the arm of his chair. Stephen's fingers intertwined with hers, strong and warm and infinitely reassuring. "Now we figure out how to build a life together," he said simply. "If that's what you want." Sandra thought about her options, few as they were. She could return to Cedar Falls, resume her work at the boarding house, and try to forget about the man who had saved her life and stolen her heart. Or she could stay here, in this beautiful wilderness, with a man who loved her despite all her flaws. The choice was easier than she had expected. "I can't think of anything I want more," she said, squeezing his hand. Stephen lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "We all have baggage," he said. "The trick is finding someone willing to help you carry it." The sound of horses approaching broke into their peaceful reverie. Stephen tensed immediately, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. But Sandra could see the relief in his eyes when Sheriff Morrison and two deputies emerged from the tree line. "Heard shots last night," Sheriff Morrison called out as he dismounted. "Figured we better come check on things." Stephen stood and helped Sandra to her feet, supporting her weight as they walked down to meet the sheriff. The story took some time to tell, but eventually the lawmen were satisfied with their account of the previous night's events. "You did good, Edwards," Sheriff Morrison said, shaking Stephen's hand. "Ross was a dangerous man, and he wouldn't have stopped until he got what he wanted." As the sheriff and his men prepared to leave, taking Ralph Ross's body with them, Sandra felt a profound sense of closure. The man who had terrorized her was gone, and she was free to start her new life without looking over her shoulder in fear. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Stephen reached into a wooden box on the mantelpiece and pulled out something wrapped in soft cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a simple gold ring that caught the firelight. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice soft with the memory. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for the woman who would help me build a new life." Sandra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as Stephen knelt before her chair, the ring balanced on his palm like a precious offering. "Sandra Martinez," he said, his voice formal but warm with love. "Will you marry me?" Sandra looked down at him, this strong, gentle man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath, who had risked his life to protect her and opened his heart to love again. The answer was easy, as natural as breathing. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Stephen Edwards, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. Sandra flexed her fingers, watching the gold catch the light, hardly able to believe that this was really happening. They were married a week later in the small church in Cedar Falls, with most of the town in attendance. Mrs. Hartwell cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and declaring it the most beautiful wedding she had ever seen. As they exchanged vows, Sandra thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Cedar Falls broken and lost, believing herself unworthy of love or happiness. But sometimes she realized the most beautiful destinations were reached by the most difficult roads. Stephen's voice was strong and clear as he promised to love and protect her for as long as they both lived. When it was her turn to speak, Sandra looked into his blue eyes and felt the last of her old fears melt away. "I promise to love you with all my heart," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small church. "To stand by your side through whatever comes, and to never again believe that I am anything less than worthy of your love." The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and sweet, full of promise for the years ahead. As they walked back up the aisle together, Sandra caught sight of her reflection in one of the church windows. The woman looking back at her was radiant with happiness, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical perfection and everything to do with being truly, completely loved. They honeymooned in their cabin, spending lazy days exploring the mountains and long evenings planning their future. Stephen taught Sandra to fish in the crystal clear streams that ran down from the high peaks, and she taught him to cook the fancy dishes she had learned during her time working in various kitchens. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sandra reflected on how much her life had changed. Just weeks before, she had been a lonely woman convinced of her own worthlessness. Now she was a wife, a partner, a woman loved and cherished for exactly who she was. "What are you thinking about?" Stephen asked, following her gaze to the spectacular vista spread out before them. Sandra smiled and leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her cheek. "Just how beautiful everything looks from up here," she said. "How different the world seems when you are not looking at it through the eyes of fear and self-doubt." Stephen's arm tightened around her, and Sandra felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. The mountains stretched out endlessly before them, wild and challenging and full of possibilities. The weeks that followed their wedding passed in a blur of happiness and discovery. Sandra threw herself into learning the rhythms of mountain life, mastering the skills she would need to thrive in their remote home. Stephen was an excellent teacher, patient and encouraging as she learned to tend their small garden and navigate the sometimes treacherous trails. In return, Sandra brought her own skills to their partnership. Her years of working in kitchens had taught her to make the most of simple ingredients, and she delighted in creating delicious meals from the game Stephen hunted and the vegetables they grew together. But perhaps most importantly, Sandra brought laughter back into Stephen's life. She had a quiet sense of humor that emerged more and more as she grew comfortable in her new role as his wife. Stephen found himself smiling more than he had in years, rediscovering the joy that had been buried beneath layers of grief. One morning in late summer, Sandra woke to find Stephen already up and dressed, standing by the window with a troubled expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up in bed and pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "Riders coming up the trail," Stephen replied, his voice grim. "3 of them, moving fast." Sandra felt a familiar flutter of fear in her stomach, but it was different now, tempered by the confidence that came from knowing she wasn't facing danger alone. The riders were still too far away to make out clearly, but Sandra could see that they were pushing their horses hard, kicking up clouds of dust as they climbed toward the cabin. Stephen moved to the gun rack and selected his rifle, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "Go to the root cellar," he told Sandra, his voice calm but firm. Sandra shook her head, surprising herself with her own determination. "I'm not hiding while you face whatever's coming alone. We're partners now, remember?" Stephen started to argue, then stopped, seeing something in her expression that made him reconsider. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small pistol, checking to make sure it was loaded before handing it to her. The riders reached the clearing just as Stephen and Sandra stepped out onto the porch. Sandra's heart sank when she recognized the lead rider as Deputy Marshal William Hayes, a hard-faced man she remembered from her previous life. "Mr. Edwards," Marshal Hayes called out, dismounting and approaching the porch. "We're looking for a woman named Sandra Martinez. Got word she might be up this way." Sandra felt her blood turn to ice. She had thought her past was buried, that the new life she had built with Stephen was safe from the mistakes and tragedies that had driven her to Cedar Falls. Stephen's stance shifted slightly, and Sandra could see him preparing for whatever might come next. "What did you want with my wife?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Marshal Hayes's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Your wife," he repeated. "Well, that does complicate things. See, Mrs. Martinez, or I guess it's Mrs. Edwards now, is wanted for questioning in connection with a death back in Kansas." Sandra felt the world tilt around her as the name hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Brennan, the man who had courted her with false kindness while mocking her behind her back. She had left Kansas without saying goodbye to him, carrying the shame of his cruel words like a stone in her chest. "I don't know anything about Thomas's death," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I left town the morning after I heard him talking about me with his friends." Marshal Hayes studied her face with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent years separating truth from lies. "Maybe so," he said finally, But there's folks back in Kansas who think different. Stephen stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sandra in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. My wife isn't going anywhere with you. Oh, Marshall. The two bounty hunters shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to their weapons. Marshall Hayes held up a hand to stop them, his expression thoughtful as he considered Stephen's words. I appreciate your position, Mr. Edwards, he said finally, but this is a legal matter that needs to be resolved properly. Sandra felt Stephen's muscles tense beside her, and she knew he was preparing to fight. The thought of him being hurt or killed because of her past mistakes was unbearable. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. It's all right, she said quietly. I'll go with them. I have nothing to hide, and running will only make me look guilty. Stephen turned to look at her, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The standoff stretched taut between them, four armed men and one woman whose fate hung in the balance. Sandra could feel the weight of everyone's attention, the potential for violence crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. It was Marshall Hayes who broke the tension. Tell you what, he said, how about we all take a step back and think about this rationally? Your wife's cooperation would go a long way toward clearing her name. Sandra knew he was right, much as she hated to admit it. She had spent too many years running from her problems, and it had never brought her anything but more pain. I'll go, she said, ignoring Stephen's sharp intake of breath. But I want my husband with me, and I want your word that I'll be treated fairly. Marshall Hayes nodded slowly. That's reasonable. Mr. Edwards can accompany you, and I'll personally ensure that you're given every consideration due to a law-abiding citizen. The journey to Kansas took the better part of a week, traveling by horseback to the nearest town with a railroad station, and then by train across the seemingly endless prairie. Stephen never left her side during the entire journey, his presence a constant source of strength and comfort. The town of Millerville, Kansas was much as Sandra remembered it, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. The people were the same, too, quick to judge and slow to forgive, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Sheriff Dawson was a thin, nervous man in his 40s who seemed overwhelmed by the attention the case had brought to his quiet town. He greeted Marshall Hayes with obvious relief and Sandra with barely concealed suspicion. The questioning began immediately, with Sheriff Dawson and Marshall Hayes taking turns asking about her relationship with Thomas Brennan and the circumstances of her departure from Millerville. Sandra answered as honestly as she could, describing Thomas's courtship, the conversation she had overheard, and her decision to leave town the next morning. The questions continued for hours, covering every detail of Sandra's time in Millerville and her relationship with Thomas. Stephen sat beside her throughout the interrogation, his presence a silent reminder that she was no longer the lonely, desperate woman who had fled Kansas months before. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the case against Sandra was built on nothing more than speculation and small-town gossip. Thomas Brennan had been found dead in his room above the general store, apparently the victim of a heart attack brought on by excessive drinking. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of foul play. But Thomas had been young and seemingly healthy, and his sudden death had shocked the community. In the absence of any clear explanation, people had begun looking for someone to blame. Sandra's abrupt departure the day after their last conversation had made her a convenient target for suspicion. The breakthrough came when Sheriff Dawson produced Thomas's personal effects, items that had been found in his room and after his death. Among them was a letter written in Thomas's own hand but never sent, addressed to Sandra. Stephen read the letter aloud, his voice steady but filled with emotion. In it, Thomas apologized for his cruel words, explaining that he had been trying to impress his friends with false bravado. He confessed that he had genuinely cared for Sandra, that her departure had left him devastated with guilt and regret. According to the doctor who examined the body, Sheriff Dawson explained, Thomas had been drinking heavily for days before his death. This letter suggests he was planning to apologize to you, Mrs. Edwards. Sandra felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to the letter. The revelation that Thomas had regretted his words, that he had cared for her enough to write such a heartfelt apology, was both healing and heartbreaking. Marshall Hayes stood and extended his hand to Sandra, his expression respectful. I think it's clear that you had nothing to do with Mr. Brennan's death, he said. You're free to go, Mrs. Edwards, with the apologies of the territory of Kansas. The relief Sandra felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by sadness for Thomas and the tragedy of their missed connection. She and Stephen left the sheriff's office, hand in hand, walking through the streets of Millerville one last time before heading to the train station. As their train pulled away from the platform, Sandra watched the town disappear into the distance and felt a profound sense of closure. She had faced her past honestly, answered for her choices, and emerged with her integrity intact. The journey back to their mountain home was peaceful and reflective. Sandra and Stephen talked about what they had learned, about the importance of communication and honesty in their own relationship, about the tragedy of lives cut short by misunderstanding and pride. When they finally reached their cabin, Sandra felt like she was returning to paradise. The mountains welcomed them back with their eternal strength and beauty, and the cabin seemed to glow with warmth and love in the evening light. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind in the pines, Stephen pulled Sandra close and whispered words that she would treasure for the rest of her life. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What you did today, facing your past like that, it took more courage than most people have in their entire lives." Sandra turned in his arms and kissed him softly, pouring all her love and gratitude into the contact. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "You gave me the strength to believe in myself." They made love then with a passion and tenderness that spoke of their deep connection, their shared trials, and their unshakable commitment to each other. Afterward, as Sandra drifted off to sleep in Stephen's arms, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a woman convinced of her own worthlessness, scarred both physically and emotionally by life's cruelties. But love had transformed her, not by changing who she was, but by helping her see herself clearly for the first time. Winter came early that year, blanketing their mountain home in pristine white snow that transformed the landscape into a wonderland of crystalline beauty. Sandra and Stephen spent long evenings by the fire, reading to each other from the small library of books they had accumulated, planning improvements for the spring. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Sandra made a discovery that would change their lives forever. She had been feeling unwell for several days, experiencing nausea and fatigue that she initially attributed to something she had eaten. But as the symptoms persisted, a different possibility began to emerge. "Stephen," she said one evening, setting down the sock she had been mending, "I think I might be with child." Stephen's face went through a series of expressions, from surprise to joy to something that looked almost like fear. He set down his own work and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his large calloused ones. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. Sandra nodded, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor." Stephen pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally loosened his grip, she could see tears in his own eyes, a mixture of joy and remembered pain. "I never thought I'd have this chance again," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "After losing Mary and little Sarah, I thought that part of my life was over forever." Sandra cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palms. "This is a new beginning for both of us," she said softly. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months, with Sandra experiencing the typical discomforts but no serious complications. Stephen was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting on doing most of the heavy work and fretting over her health constantly. As spring arrived and Sandra's condition became more obvious, they began making trips to Cedar Falls more frequently, consulting with the town's doctor and preparing for the birth. The people of the town had fully accepted Sandra as Stephen's wife, and many of the women offered advice and assistance. Mrs. Hartwell was particularly excited about the pregnancy, treating Sandra like a beloved daughter and insisting on knitting enough baby clothes to outfit triplets. The baby was born on a warm day in late spring with Dr. Mitchell in attendance and Stephen pacing the cabin like a caged wolf. Sandra's labor was long but not particularly difficult, and when their son finally made his appearance, he was perfect in every way that mattered. Stephen held his son for the first time with hands that trembled with emotion, his face transformed by a joy so profound it was almost painful to witness. The baby was small but healthy, with dark hair like his father's and eyes that would eventually turn the same deep blue. "What should we call him?" Stephen asked, his voice hushed with reverence. Sandra had been thinking about names for months, but in that moment, only one seemed right. Thomas, she said softly. Thomas Stephen Edwards. After the man whose death brought us together, and after his father who gave me a new life. Stephen nodded, understanding the significance of the choice. Thomas it is, he agreed. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and alert, with a temperament that seemed to combine the best qualities of both his parents. Sandra took to motherhood with a natural grace that surprised her, finding strength and patience she hadn't known she possessed. Stephen was a devoted father, spending hours talking to his son, teaching him about the mountains and the wildlife that surrounded their home. Sandra often found them together on the porch, Stephen pointing out birds and explaining the changing seasons to a baby who couldn't possibly understand but seemed to listen with rapt attention nonetheless. As Thomas grew and began to show his own personality, Sandra reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this place. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Cedar Falls, broken and convinced of her own worthlessness. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime whose pain and self-doubt had been healed by love and acceptance. The scar on her face was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined her. When Thomas looked at her with his bright blue eyes, she saw only love and trust and perfect acceptance. When Stephen looked at her, she saw desire and respect and a love so deep it took her breath away. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sandra thought about all the women who might be out there somewhere, believing themselves unworthy of love because of their scars or their perceived imperfections. She wanted to find them all and tell them what she had learned, that true beauty came from within, that the right person would see their worth even when they couldn't see it themselves. But for now, it was enough to sit here with her family, watching their son discover the world around him with wonder and delight. Sandra had found her happily ever after in the most unexpected place, with a man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath, who had taught her to see herself clearly for the first time in her life. The mountains stretched out before them, eternal and unchanging, a testament to the enduring power of love and the possibility of redemption. Sandra had finally found her place in the world, and it was more beautiful than anything she had ever dared to dream. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Stephen reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Thomas gurgled contentedly in Sandra's arms, his small fist wrapped around one of her fingers as if he never intended to let go. "I love you," Stephen said simply, the words carrying all the weight of their shared history and their hopes for the future. "And I love you," Sandra replied, her voice strong and certain. "Thank you for teaching me that I was beautiful all along." They sat together in perfect contentment, a family united by love and strengthened by the trials they had overcome together. The woman who had once whispered that she was too ugly for any man had discovered that she was, in fact, exactly beautiful enough for the right man. And in finding that truth, she had found herself.